Good morning, everybody. You're supposed to start these things off with a joke. I only really know one kind of semi-good Polish story, and all my Polish friends know this, so I'm going. Forgive me for the repeat. But about 20 years ago, I was living in Seattle, and a good friend of mine that I always played tennis with. Unfortunately, we're not going to talk about tennis in this talk, but a good friend that I used to play tennis with. His name is Pavel, and you know, after every tennis session, I would always ask him, like, Pavel, teach me some Polish, teach me some Polish. And he'd get so angry with me. He'd be like, Dan, you don't want to learn Polish. It's a useless language. You'll never use it, right? And like every day, it'd be like, Pavel, teach me some Polish, teach me some Polish, teach me. So one day, just to shut me up, because he got so sick of me asking, right? So one day, he's like, Dan, if you ever find yourself in Poland, go up to the first person you meet and say, and apologies for the accent here. Go up to the first person that you meet and say, "Gdzie jest łazienka?" So, so, so the joke is on Pavel, right? I can use Polish. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here. I am the one who's honored to be able to kick off this conference. A couple years ago, I was supposed to be here. Unfortunately, an illness meant that I wasn't able to join. So I'm so glad that this conference got restarted and I'm able to be here. Can I tell you how thrilled I am with one of the themes of the conference? Revive, renew, rediscover. I'm going to be focusing on the rediscover piece. When I first, full transparency, right? When I first sat down to write this presentation, I went on this diatribe about how all agile frameworks suck and everything's terrible and why are we even doing this stuff? But I wanted to be a little bit more positive than that. I mean, don't get me wrong. We'll get into some of that a little bit later. You'll see. You'll see. I have some things to say about that. But I wanted to be a little bit more positive because the trend in America, anyway. I don't know if it's the same over here in Europe, but the trend in America has been fairly disturbing. A lot of the layoffs in the tech industry have really hit agile coaches, scrum masters, and things like that. And it's not. It's pretty easy to understand why companies are making the decisions that they're making. I would argue Agile has failed them. I would argue our industry has failed them. And so when they go look for cost cutting, when they go look for improvements, one of the places they're going to go look at is agile coaches, rightly or wrongly, right? That's what they're going to do. So it's hard not to be kind of depressed. But I think there's some things, that we can do to change that. I hope there's some things that we can do to change that. But in the interest of rediscover, I want to go back not just to the Agile Manifesto, and we'll talk about my thoughts on the Agile Manifesto here a little bit later too, but to even before the Agile Manifesto, to hopefully somebody that a lot of you have heard before, and if you haven't, this is going to be your chance to hear about. A guy by the name of Dr. W. Edwards Deming. And he's the one, as you can tell, he's the one that I stole the title of this talk from, because it's really not a new agile economics. A lot of this is just a rehash of stuff that has been talked about for the past 50 years, even really past 100 years. Dr. Edwards Deming wrote a book called The New Economics. And in that book, if anybody has read it, in that book, he talks about 4 things that you need to understand, that you need to do, that you need to be familiar with if you are going to be successful at transforming the way that you work. 4 things, right? Those 4 things are appreciation for a system, knowledge about variation, theory of knowledge, and understanding psychology. Now, Agile, I think, has done a fairly decent job, not great, but a fairly decent job at 3 of these things. Everybody I think is familiar with systems thinking. Hopefully everybody's heard of psychological safety and things like that. The one thing that almost nobody talks about in Agile, at least in my not so humble opinion, the one thing that almost nobody talks about in Agile is this idea of variation. And so this is the point that I want to focus on for the rest of the talk today, because once you understand variation, I think understanding variation is the key to understanding what's really holding us back from being truly agile, at least how our customers think we should be agile anyway. And so To explain variation, I actually need to tell a story. I hope everybody's okay with, well, the problem with Agile conferences and the problem with Agile coaches in general is they don't really like sports analogies all that much. So I hope you're going to bear with me. I do have a sports analogy. It's about basketball. Everybody in Poland is so tall. Does everybody play basketball? I know like handball and stuff. Does everybody play? Because I'm short Italian, right? So I don't play basketball. Although I would argue us Italians are better at football than you Polish. Proper football, not American football, is what I'm talking about. Anyway, we're gonna talk about basketball. Specifically, I got this idea from Malcolm Gladwell. Now, again, full disclosure, I really not that familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's work. I haven't read any of his books. I don't listen to his podcast, even though he has this podcast called Revisionist History. It's not that I don't like him. It's just I've never really gotten into him. But a friend of mine recommended to me his podcast, Revisionist History. I don't know if everybody's familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History. And one of the episodes on Revisionist History was called "The Big Man Can't Shoot." This is back in 2016. The Big Man Can't Shoot. And that particular episode was about what was dubbed the greatest basketball game ever played. Maybe some of you have heard about this game, maybe some of you haven't, but this game took place in Hershey, Pennsylvania on March 2nd, I think it's March 2nd, 1962. It was between Philadelphia and somebody else or whatever, but the reason that it's known is because of this gentleman right here. His name is Wilt Chamberlain. On that night in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Wilt Chamberlain scored 100 points in that game. It's never been done before. It's never been done since. No one's even, in fact, no one's even really ever come close. Wilt Chamberlain puts up 100 points in that game. Now, Malcolm Gladwell has a theory as to why Wilt Chamberlain did so well. So, to kind of explain why, I need to give some background about Wilt himself. If you don't know about Wilt, in the early 60s, he had already established himself as kind of the dominant force in the NBA. He was the best player by far. He'd already won tons of awards. I think he'd won some MVPs. He'd won Rookie of the Year or whatever. But the thing that he is not good at, the one thing he's not good at, is shooting free throws. And everybody knows this. Right, that's kind of the big knock on Wilt, is he just can't shoot free throws. But Malcolm Gladwell states, on that night in Hershey, Pennsylvania, in case anyone's wondering, by the way, Hershey, Pennsylvania is where they make Hershey's chocolate. We don't like to admit to that, by the way, in America. Has anyone had Hershey's chocolate? It's just awful. It's just terrible. I don't even know why we even call it chocolate. But anyway, at that night, Gladwell says at that night in Hershey, Pennsylvania, he says, Wilt is an incredible free throw shooter. He gives this evidence. He says, Wilt's career free throw percentage is 51%, so just over half. He misses just as much as he makes, pretty much. But he says on that night, Gladwell says on that night, on the 100-point game night, Wilt Chamberlain shoots 87.5%. Right? He says that shooting performance is what caused him to score the 100 points. Now, like every good story, there's a twist. Okay? If anybody's watched basketball, you probably know that most NBA players, when they shoot free throws, they use an overhand motion, just like they do when they're shooting a regular shot, right? They'll use an overhand motion. In the 1962 season, however, because Wilt Chamberlain was so bad at shooting free throws, he switches to an underhand motion. The pejorative for this in America, I don't know if you have the same expression over here in Poland, but the pejorative of this is, it's called a granny shot, right? And you can imagine, the jokes that were made about Wilt as he shot this. On that night in Hershey, Pennsylvania, Wilt Chamberlain was shooting underhand. He wasn't shooting overhand. He was shooting underhand. And Gladwell goes on to say, it's because of that change, because of that one change from shooting overhand to underhand for his free throw percentage, that is what caused him, I'll just read it. It pays off in the greatest basketball game ever played, right? The question is, were free throws really what caused that change? What caused that level of success? As was mentioned in my introduction, if we want to verify a finding, the very first thing we have to do is we have to go look at the data, right? Now, I want to be clear. There are two things that we have to look at here. There are two things that Gladwell's talking about. First, he's saying the number of points that Wilt scored, the 100 points, that's one metric we need to look at, how many points he scores. The second metric that we need to look at is his free throw percentage. So we're going to look at those separately. And I'll try to make sure to explain the difference as I go through. The first one I want to look at is his total points. If we go through for that 1962 season and we look at his total points, Wilt's total points over the course of that season, and we plot them just as a running record from left to right every game, this is what the chart looks like. Now, at first glance, it's probably pretty easy. Hopefully everybody can see where that 100-point game is. Right? Can everybody see that? It's right there. Right? Pretty easy to see. That's the points per game. Now let's look at his free throw percentage. We're going to do the same approach, and we're going to look at his free throw percentage over the course of the year. Right? So this is his free throw percentage. Now, what's interesting, when I plotted this, before maybe I give you the punchline, when I first plotted this, see if everybody sees the same thing that I did. I didn't immediately notice the 100-point game. Does anybody want to make a guess? I mean, maybe just mentally, I don't know, or you can shout it out if you want to. Anybody want to make a guess? What was the point that Dan first saw? Anybody have any thoughts? So let's orient us, right? That's the March 2nd game. That's not the one that I saw. Anyone? All right, if you look just 4 games prior to this, it's like, I think it was about a week before this game, you'll see this dot right here. Now, not only is this dot the lowest of this season, but I think it's the second or third lowest of his career. Now, what fascinated me about Malcolm Gladwell's conclusion is he focused on the March 2nd dot. He said, oh, look, this is the greatest game ever. But he conveniently ignores the one right before, where it's essentially his worst shooting performance. And anybody, maybe people who know sports better than I do, I try to do a lot of research on this. I can find, other than some obscure basketball statistics websites, I can't find really any information about this game on February 24th, his worst shooting performance ever. Right? What's going on here? Now, we have to be careful because just by looking at one data point or 2 data points, we can't necessarily draw any conclusions about whether this is good or bad. And the reason that we can't do that is because of something called variation. Right? This data right here, this is the free throw data, right? This data here is an excellent example of what I mean when I say variation. Whenever you're operating a process, whenever you're collecting data off of that process, all processes exhibit variation, all data exhibit variation. What I mean by that is you can see, that's not me, is it? What you can see is, as we go from game to game, there are changes. There are changes in his free throw percentage. This is to be expected, right? We wouldn't expect Wilt Chamberlain to show up and shoot the exact same free throw percentage every single game, right? Those little changes are part of the normal operation of the process. So the idea with variation is not to react to every single little change. We have to understand that as the process operates, there are going to be these changes. So the idea is not to react to every single change. The idea is to understand when is a change too big that we do need to react. Right? So the first lesson of variation is this, right? That all data have noise, some data have signal. Any data set that you look at, any process that you're operating is going to exhibit variation. Most of the time, the vast majority of the time, that data is going to represent noise, just the normal operation of the process. Every so often, though, we will get something that's called signal that we're going to have to respond to. Okay? So if we want to improve our process, here's the deal. If we want to improve our process, we have to learn to separate the potential signal from the probable noise. This is a little bit harder than you might think it is, but this is what we need to do. Potential signal from the probable noise. Because if we don't do that, if we don't separate potential signal from probable noise, we are apt to make one of 2 or both of these mistakes. And that is to mistake noise for signal or that is to mistake signal for noise. We will make these mistakes. Hopefully you're already starting to think about how Agile makes both of these mistakes in a second. But we are apt, if we don't learn to separate out signal for noise, we're apt to make one or both of these mistakes. So what we want to do is we want to separate out signal from noise in such a way that it minimizes the economic impact of making one or both. This is a big deal. Imagine what Wilt would do is like every time, I don't know if I can go back to that slide. Yeah, let's go back to it. Let's just go back very quickly. Imagine if every time, if we zoom in here, look, he's like, oh, I got better, I got better, I got worse, I got better, I got worse, I got better, right? Imagine if every data point that came in, he was reacting to that, and he was trying to tweak his tweak his game, tweak his motion or whatever. You can see how that would probably cause much more problems than it would provide any solutions. So this is the whole point of variation. Luckily for us, about 100 years ago, literally 100 years ago, this gentleman came along and solved the problem for us. He came up with a rigorous mathematical approach to being able to look at a process, look at a data set, and be able to confidently separate out that signal from noise. I'd be very surprised if maybe some of you know who this is, but if some of you have heard of Deming, probably even fewer people have heard of this gentleman, and his name is Dr. Walter Shewhart. Mm-hmm. Now, if you go read Deming, all the bits where Deming talks about variation, he actually references Dr. Shewhart. Talks about Dr. Shewhart's method, Dr. Shewhart's approach, Dr. Shewhart's theory, Dr. Shewhart, right? 100 years ago, Dr. Shewhart was writing about this. So what Dr. Shewhart came along, he said, if we have a data set, we can take this data set and we can apply some mathematics to it. And by the way, I'm not going to get into the mathematics of how you do this. You're just going to have to trust me that I'm doing it right. I'm doing the mathematics right. Not going to get into that. If anybody has any questions, I'm hoping to have plenty of time afterward, by the way, for questions. So if anybody has any questions about that, please let me know. We can maybe get into that a little bit. But he said we can apply some mathematics to our data sets, and we can create what's known as a process behavior chart. And on this process behavior chart, we can draw boundaries around that data to say, okay, within these boundaries, that's the probable noise in the system. Outside of these boundaries, that's the possible signal. Right? So you can see this is the 100-point game, the points per game for Wilt Chamberlain. Stuff between those boundaries, probable noise, that's possible signal. Probable noise is called routine variation, possible signal is called exceptional variation. That was Walter Shewhart's approach. Right? And the idea is simple. Right? If we have a process that is exhibiting only routine variation, then that process is said to be operating to its full potential, to its full capacity, to its full capability. It is therefore said to be predictable. Anything outside, if we ever get exceptional variation, we say, hey, you know what, something has shifted in our process. It's not predictable anymore. That's when we require action. Let me try to give you maybe a simple example would help. Let's say I've got a six-sided die. I'm rolling a six-sided die. Right? Now, if I were to roll that die and it comes up 2, and then I would roll the die again and it comes up 5, can I draw any conclusions about that? And the answer to that is no. I would expect to sometimes roll 2. I would expect to sometimes roll 5. I would expect to sometimes roll 6, to sometimes roll 1, right? So anytime I roll that's predictable. That's within the full capability of the process. If I were to roll a 7, however, now we would have something to talk about, right? Or if I were to roll a 0, now we have something to talk about. That's really kind of the whole idea. Right? So let's look at this. You knew it was going to happen sooner or later. So let's look at this in the context of a quote-unquote Agile team. And this is a Scrum team doing 2-week sprints. This is real data, by the way. This is real data from a Scrum team doing 2-week sprints. These are the cycle times for all the PBIs that they product backlog items, for all the product backlog items that they finished over a long time. As you might expect, there is variation in our process. There's variation in this system. If we take Shewhart's approach and we apply his mathematics, we can draw our limit on this data, and that upper limit is 65 days. The lower limit is 0. Cycle time data is always going to be 0 bounded, so it's usually 0. So that upper limit is 65 days. What do you think about this Scrum team? They're doing 14-day sprints. Variations all over the place. Upper limit 65 days. What do you think? That is kind of rhetorical, but if anybody wants to shout anything out, feel free. They're quite stable? I would agree with that. I have a hard time arguing with that. Anybody have anything bad to say about this team? We think they're predictable? They're not very good? Right? Normally when I show this to people, these are the types of comments that I get. In fact, I was just had this conversation recently, I think within the last month or so. And these are the types of comments I get when I show that data. You get things like, this team is terrible at estimation. Awful at estimation, right? This team is terrible at planning. This team is terrible at refinement. They're just awful. 14-day sprints. That upper limit, 65 days. They're terrible at estimation, planning, right? They're terrible at all that stuff. When we think about it from a variation perspective, does anybody see the problem with these statements? These statements are the language of signal, right? They're the language of signal. We are reacting to the fact that we've set, I'll just start saying it. By the way, somebody keep track. We're going to play a drinking game here. Somebody keep track. Every time I say the word arbitrary, take a drink, right? And somebody for me for the rest of the presentation, count how many times I say arbitrary.
I'll count.
It's going to be in the dozens, if not 100, right? So the thing is, as was suggested, there is no signal here. We want to rush to conclusions. We want to say that action is needed on this process. This team is no good. They have to change something because they're terrible at estimation, they're terrible at planning. We want to say that, but the data doesn't support that there is any problem here. Right? And this is the first thing that most people get wrong when we talk about variation, is the difference between the voice of the customer and the voice of the process. Anytime you have some type of external specification or an external guide, that's what's known as the voice of the customer. Right? Somebody outside of the system is arbitrarily saying, here, you have to do this. Right? That's the voice of the customer. And I'm not saying that's good or that's bad. I'm just saying it's arbitrary, right? Versus the voice of the process, which is what the data is telling us. Our process is speaking to us through data. And so if we have this external specification, if we have this external guide, that doesn't tell us, number one, that we can even design a process to be able to meet that specification. Or I would argue, and more importantly, number two, that it's even a good idea to. Right? So if we look at this more from a kind of agile perspective, anytime you have an arbitrary time box, that's the voice of the customer. When somebody comes along and says, you have to get stuff done in 30 days or less, or I don't know what the guidance in SAFe is. Forgive me, I'm not a SAFe expert. I don't know if SAFe says anything like that. But if they come along and they say that, that's the voice of the customer. Again, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm saying that's just an arbitrary target. Most teams do 14-day sprints because most teams do 14-day sprints, right? It's completely arbitrary versus what your process is capable of, right? So this team here, believe it or not, even though it routinely misses its time box, none of those misses represent signal. This process is predictable. Hopefully that's making sense. Hopefully it's resonating. So just like with Wilt Chamberlain, if you were to react every single time that you miss your sprint plan, if you're doing Scrum, if you were to react every time you do your sprint plan, you're most likely making that mistake of noise for signal. So shout out any questions if I'm going too fast or this doesn't make sense. You're probably introducing more problems than you're solving. Because think about this, what were these teams' conversations every time they went into a sprint retrospective? What were these teams' conversations? They were probably talking about how much they suck because they can't deliver in 14 weeks or 14 days, 14 weeks. That's probably better, 14 days. So the only way to know if action is truly warranted is to be able to separate signal from noise, like I was talking about. So does that mean that this team's time box, that this team's sprint length should be 65 days? Is that the conclusion that we're supposed to draw from this? I'm wondering if maybe some of you are thinking this. Doesn't that mean we should set a sprint length of 65 days? Is that what that means? No. No, 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 no. The point here is we are trying to shove a bunch of stuff that is variable. We're trying to shove remember I said, everything about your process is variation. PBIs are variable in complexity. They are variable in duration. They are variable in value. We're trying to take all these variable things and shove them into an arbitrary fixed length time box, right? That's not the solution that we're looking for. What we really need is something more like what I would argue, continual or continuous flow. Right? Get rid of those arbitrary time boxes because they cause way too much dysfunction. They introduce way too much noise into the system. Get rid of those arbitrary time boxes and focus on flow. What I mean by flow, hopefully this animation works, is items are allowed to just move through the process in the amount of time that it takes them to move through the process. Right, that they are allowed to just flow through, independent of any specification or guide that we set. By doing this, we can study and we can understand what's going on in our process. I've got a couple quick asides here because I want to get back to the continuous flow here thing in a second. If we talk about, here's where I get to do my rant about the Agile Manifesto. I'm not a fan of the Agile Manifesto. I'm not. The idea that 20 old white guys went up a mountain and wrote this document and came down and put them on like golden tablets and handed them to the rest of the world and said, it is thus and so, and you must do this. Give me a break. Not to mention they were mostly Americans, right? Give me a break. But the one thing they did get right, even white guys get right every once in a while, is they never mention, read the manifesto, read the principles behind the manifesto. They never once mention time box or fixed length or sprints, or they don't mention any of that stuff. But they do mention continuous twice. That word continuous is in there twice. It's one thing that they do get right. So even the Agile Manifesto, for all its faults, even the Agile Manifesto gets this idea of continual flow right? So then we get this objection, and most of you are probably thinking this too. Well, if we don't have time boxes, how are we supposed to manage complexity? How are we supposed to know how long stuff takes to get done? In a flow world, stuff, you just put it in, and stuff just takes as long as it needs to take to get done, and customers could be waiting forever, right? Anybody heard these objections before? Right? Remember I was just talking about how understanding variation necessitates that we're constantly monitoring the process for signal. You don't, in a flow world, you don't just shove something into the process and just say, okay, well, it just takes as long as it takes. Sooner or later, that's going to be signal. Sooner or later, it's going to take so long that's going to be signal. And remember I said, the second that you get signal, you need to react, right? It's just we need to measure our process. We need to monitor and measure our process so that we get that signal in real time. I'll get that to a second because what we really need to talk about now is this whole idea of planning, right? If we get rid of time boxes, think about this. If we're able to get rid of time boxes, what does that do to planning? Right? Because we need that time box. I would argue that's probably really the whole point of time boxes. Don't get me started on story points, but the whole reason I think story points took off was because teams struggled so much to estimate for planning. Right? Again, wrong approach to the wrong answer, to the wrong question, right? So let's talk about planning for a second. Remember, in planning, we do things, we try to estimate how long does this particular item take or how complex it is or whatever, because we need to know how many of these things we can fit into our time box. That's one of the questions that we're trying to answer in planning. We need to know that. Our customers need to know that. Yes, our customers are going to ask this question, but there are better ways to answer it, right? And that's, remember I said, we're monitoring this stuff in real time. If you move to a more flow world, now we've got an opportunity to apply flow metrics. And these are the metrics that we are collecting in real time. things like cycle time, things like throughput, things like work item age, work in progress. Anytime these metrics exhibit exceptional variation, we need to react, right? It's not, oh, our sprint ended and we didn't get everything done, so that's bad. No, it's this item is taking longer than the stuff that we've seen in the past. That's bad. Right? It's a different way of thinking about that, right? So like I said, using flow metrics, we can adjust to that signal in near real time. So I would argue, instead of planning, what we want to do is things like this, right? Monitor whip age, controlling whip. This is a whole talk in itself, by the way. And again, if anybody has any questions, we might be able to talk about that later. But monitoring whip age, controlling whip. By the way, those two things is what will allow us to get some type of system stability. And when I say system stability, I do not mean a system free of variation. Remember, we'll never get rid of variation, but I do mean that we've controlled that variation such that we can do things like probabilistic forecasting, things like that. If you focus on flow, and if you're tracking these metrics and you're doing system stability type things, the forecasting really kind of takes care of itself. It's pretty easy. It's pretty straightforward. How we think about that forecasting is another matter altogether, right? But for me, this graphic kind of captures what I'm talking about. If we're able to draw boundaries around our process, we want to talk about what are the things that it's going to take to make sure that our process is always operating within those boundaries. Now, there's another conversation that needs to be had about what can we do for improvement, things like that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, that's for another talk. The other problem with planning, I would argue this is the biggest problem with planning, but the other problem with planning is think about when you're asked to make that plan. When are you asked to come up with a plan? Is it when the work's finished? No. It's before the work has even started, right? It's another way of saying that, this is the way I always say it, another way of saying that, it's when we are at our point of greatest uncertainty. You're asked to make a plan when you know the least amount of stuff. That's when you're asked to make a plan. And it's worse than that, because usually coming out of whatever planning session that we have, we automatically assume we're right. When variation tells us it's much more likely that we'll be wrong. In fact, it's overwhelmingly likely that we are wrong. We have to assume we're wrong and we're not right. Now, to Scrum's credit, Scrum will say, just because sprint planning has ended doesn't mean that your planning is over. They say you actually have to review that plan on a regular basis, on a daily basis. They say you need to review that plan. And that's great, but even that statement's a bit disingenuous. Because if you read closely, which plan are we actually monitoring? We're monitoring progress toward the sprint goal. Again, we're assuming that the sprint goal that we set is correct. We have to assume we're wrong. You can't assume that you're right. You have to assume that you're wrong. And Scrum would say, I know it sounds like I'm bashing Scrum. I'm not bashing. I mean, I kind of am. I know I am. It's more the guidance rather than the people. I want to make sure. I'm talking about the guidance. I'm not talking about the people who practice. I'm not saying you're a bad person if you do Scrum. That's not what I'm saying at all. Or if you do SAFe. I'm really not. But we're actually monitoring our plan toward the sprint goal. And they would say the second that we find out that the sprint goal is invalid, we have to tear down the sprint and start over again. Well, it's more likely that we're wrong than we're right. And so I would argue every PBI that is flowing through our process, every PBI needs to be a goal in and of itself. And if we finish it, we will learn. And our future decisions should be based on what that learning is from that PBI. We don't need to go through the overhead of tearing down sprints and starting them up and things like that. So the biggest problem with planning is timing. Right? We're asked to make that plan at the beginning, when we have the least amount of information. Again, I had to get this one in. I apologize. I had to get this one in. But for anyone who doesn't doubt that Scrum really wants to be a deterministic project management framework, there's actually hints in the guide itself. Now let's do some Let's do a pop quiz. This one I do want answers to. We're doing a sprint. Let's say we're doing a 30-day sprint. The Scrum Guide says, for a 30-day sprint, how long do I get for planning? Up to 8 hours. Planning, remember at the beginning, where I have the least amount of information. At the end, when I'm reviewing how I did, and I'm trying to understand how I adjust, so I'll even bundle these two together, the sprint review and the sprint retrospective, how long do I get for those? How long do I get for the sprint review? 4 hours for the retrospective? 3. Scrum actually tells us we should spend more time planning than reviewing, when the actual opposite is the truth. You should get planning done in about 15 minutes, 5 minutes. From a lean perspective, planning is waste. Anything more than that. And remember, we need to assume we're wrong, right? So really, if we are going to invest time, the time should be spent learning. Once we've learned, that's where the time should be spent. Sorry, had to get that in there because this guidance just drives me nuts. I can't even tell you how much that freaks me out. Okay, but now you're thinking, well, if we don't plan, how are we supposed to know what we're supposed to be working on? Because planning is not only how many things we can get done, it's, well, which ones should we even be working on? That means that we need some type of prioritization, right? We need some type of prioritization. But again, the problem with prioritization, when do you do that prioritization? Is it when the work is finished? It's when the work is started. Again, the problem with prioritization is timing. You're doing all this stuff, before you even work on it. Now, it's worse the longer that our iteration is, whether we're doing 14 days or 30 days or, I don't know, what is safe, 3 months or something like that? Forgive me, I don't know what safe is. But think about all the things that change in that 14-day time, in that 30-day time, in that 3-month time. Not only are we learning more stuff, but new things come in, right? Business environment changes. Right? All of those things are going to be happening, which means, again, because of variation, we have to assume that we are wrong. And so every time a new PBI comes in, does that mean we have to reorder our whole list? Every time we learn something, does that mean we need to reprioritize our whole list? Every time the business landscape changes, does that mean we need to think about how wasteful those activities are? Because we don't even know if we have capacity to do that work. We don't even know if it's a good idea to do that work. Only when we get some idea of, hey, when we're in this type of situation where, our flow is signaling to us that, yeah, we can pull something in. We have capacity to pull something in. Only when we get that signal does it make sense to have those conversations about prioritization and ordering. We should be doing that just in time. Right? We finish something, we have capacity freed up to pull something in. Okay, now let's talk about what's the next one most important, in this example anyway, what's the next one most important thing? Why would we talk about what's the next 10 most important things? Because we don't even know if we're going to get to them. Hopefully that understands how prioritization is kind of wasteful. So variation means, getting through all this. Variation means fixing time boxes cause dysfunction. Big upfront planning doesn't work. Prioritization is waste. That's really kind of. Oh, sorry. Some people were taking a picture. Did you get your picture? In short, the practices that you think are making you agile are actually holding you back. This is what our customers, all these problems I'm talking about, this is what our customers are saying. Right? We talk about true business agility. It's not going to come from time boxes. It's not going to come from planning. It's not going to come from prioritization. We need a new agile economics, and I would argue that the new agile economics looks something like this. Right? In the presence of variation, we should favor continual flow over time boxing. We should favor stable systems over planning. We should favor just-in-time over prioritization. I'm putting this in kind of familiar language, so hopefully it resonates a little bit. Right? This is how we need to work going forward. Because the deterministic project management-esque or whatever notions of Agile frameworks in the past clearly aren't working for us. Like I said, at least in America, anyway. I don't know about here. We got to go back to Wilt. I never finished the story about Wilt. Right? So, did his underhand shooting actually make a difference? Anybody have any guesses? Right. So, if we take Short's approach and we apply Short's mathematics to his points per game, remember points per game, this is his points per game. Yeah, the 100-point game is possible signal. Something happened there. Something extraordinary happened there. That's probably not a surprise. Absolutely something extraordinary happened there. However, if we look at his free throw percentage, remember that dot that I talked about before? That's actually pretty strong evidence that the underhand shooting technique made him worse. Didn't better, made him worse. Right? And so the point of this, hopefully that I'm getting home here, is that Malcolm Gladwell is making a classic mistake when it comes to variation. He is mistaking noise for signal. Right? He is assuming that just because Wilt, let me go back here. Let me this over here. This one, you see right there, that's the 100-point game free throw percentage. That's well in the noise. He's saying that noise is signal. It's not, right? This signal down here is signal, but that noise is signal. So it's actually, I put the Wikipedia link up here. It's actually a pretty interesting story. I think what really happened that night is far more interesting than, Wilt Chamberlain got really good at shooting free throws. Not that I really recommend anybody go to Wikipedia, because the more I deal with Wikipedia, the more I realize that it's really kind of dodgy. But if we can trust such that we can, this article, it's a pretty interesting story. If anybody wants to go read that. So I don't want you making the same mistakes that Gladwell's making. Bottom line, I don't want you making. I want you to study your process and not worry about any external specification, not worry about any external guide, not worry about what you've been told what Agile really is. Study your process in your context, and you can start to make adjustments from there. Right? That's really what I'm talking about. So to sum up, most of you are probably interpreting this talk as Scrum and Safe sucks. Don't do Scrum and Safe. Do Kanban. I've been really, hopefully I've been really, really careful not to say the word Kanban. I don't think I've said it once. Have I said it once? We'll have to go to the tape. I'm not sure. We'll have to go to the tape.
I'll count. Right now it's 2.
That's not what I'm saying. Believe it or not. That's really, really, really not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that to be truly agile, it will encompass some level of flow. You have to understand flow to be agile. You can have flow without agility, but you can't have agility without flow. You just can't. Now, if you go read the Kanban guide, you will see that we are very careful in that guide. We say that Kanban is a strategy. We don't say it's the strategy, but we say it's a strategy to optimize flow. Now, obviously, I'm biased, so I would argue it's probably the best strategy. But all I really care about, all I really want you to get out of this is flow, having some notion of flow, because I think flow has been de-emphasized in our world. And if we want to get to that business agility, it'll mean some type of flow. So to paraphrase Deming, if I can just read this, this talk is for anyone who's living under the tyranny of the prevailing style of agile frameworks. I think this is a rephrasing of the very first sentence of the new. I think it's the very first sentence of the of the new economics. Our traditional agile frameworks have failed us. We need a new way of thinking about this stuff. And that thinking is that all process is variation. You might want to escape variation, but it will always be there. You might want to run and hide from it. You can't. Variation will always win, right? So because of variation, things that we thought were working for us, fixed lengths time boxes, big upfront planning, prioritization, backlog management, these things that we thought were working for us, they don't really serve us. In my not so humble opinion, they don't serve us. But there's hope. Like I said, I wanted to end on a positive note. I don't want this to be a downer. I want this to be kind of a hopeful, positive presentation. The hope is that we have the tools, and these tools have been around for literally 100 years. that can help us get us back on track, literally 100 years. So just like Deming, understanding variation is going to require us to rediscover. Thank you again, whoever came up with that theme. Thank you very much for the theme, whoever came up with that theme. To rediscover this new agile economics. Couple things to sum up before I jump into questions. Number one, special thanks to my muse. This is Nisha. I don't know if anyone's ever seen Nisha. She has all my best ideas, and so I want to make sure that we say thanks to Nisha. Thank you to Nisha. If you want to learn more, if you haven't read Deming, please go read Deming. If you want specifically about variation, the person that you need to read up on is the person on the right here. That's Dr. Donald Wheeler. He is the definitive living resource, you can't say resource. I don't know why you can't. The definitive living embodiment of knowledge of variation. So I'll give you his website here in a second, but if you want to learn more about variation. I also want to take this opportunity this is my first public announcement of this. In a month's time, I'm publishing my next book, roughly a month's time, I'm publishing my next book, which is a follow-on to my first book, which is, first book was Agile Metrics for Predictability, Actionable Agile Metrics for Predictability. This is going to be volume 2. Where I dive much deeper into the idea of applying variation to flow. For other information, so SPC Press is Dr. Wheeler's website. Like I said, that's your definitive guide to variation. If you want to learn about variation, go do that. ActionableAgile.com, Pro Combine. And if you want to have a little bit of fun, it's a little bit too early. We probably should have had a drink this morning. It's a little bit too early, but my friend and colleague Pratik Singh and I get together from time to time and do a Drunk Agile podcast. Maybe some of you have seen it. If you've watched it, thanks for watching. If you haven't, check us out. These conversations are always so much more fun over alcohol. And PS doing this. Questions? I've hopefully left a lot of time. I've purposely left a lot of time for questions. So.
And thank you for that, Dan. There are already a lot of questions. I'll be still monitoring if any new are coming in. So we have 23 minutes now. Okay, so the most liked question right now starts with an assumption. If Scrum works everywhere except the velocity metric, is problematic when I change the metric rather than changing Scrum. And I think you kind of answered this, but still, your perspective on that. Is it just that we need to change the metric we use in Scrum to make it better?
So it says if Scrum works everywhere?
In every way, except the velocity metric.
Okay.
We've started with an assumption.
I guess I'd love to know everybody else's thought if Scrum works in every way. So let me take that last part first. Dropping the velocity metric, it's a start. I mean, I would absolutely. All tools are good and all tools are bad. So I don't want to sit here and say, hey, you're doing this, you're wrong, do this, it's right. So all tools are good, all tools are bad. Just depends on how you use them. If there is a tool that I would say just in general does more harm than good, and I would have a hard time ever recommending it, it would be story points. And I go back and forth on this. What has done Agile more harm? Has it been the fixed length time boxes or has it been the story points? Honestly, I'd probably lead more toward the story points. I think but again, I think the story points were a function of those fixed length time boxes. So if we can get rid of the fixed length time boxes, the need for story points, I think goes away. So I think, getting rid of velocity is a start, if I understand the question, right? That's one place to start. Mm-hmm. But again, I don't want to say if it's working for you, don't let me stand up here and say, oh, you're doing it wrong. If it's working for you, it's working for you. That's just not the anecdotal evidence that I've had that story points work.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. Moving on to the next.
Okay.
This one is interesting. And why is process predictability a goal worth pursuing? Why should it be a goal worth pursuing?
So many reasons. Most importantly, the reason that process predictability is worth pursuing is because that's what our customers care about. Mm-hmm. Our customers care about predictability. Now, here's the deal. I want to be careful. When I say predictability, Remember, variation is always present. Variation is always present. And most people, and I think this is where we fall into traps, I think, in the Agile world, most people think predictability means deterministic, that we can know with 100% metaphysical certitude how long it's going to take something to get done or how long it's going to take all these items to finish. But remember, in the presence of variation, things are changing all the time. There is uncertainty built into the system. We don't know. We don't know with 100% certainty how long it's going to take something to get done. But just because our process is random, just because there's a whole bunch of uncertainty built into it, doesn't mean that our process can't be predictable. I say this all the time. I do a predictability class, and I say this all the time. Anybody who believes that a random process or an uncertain process can't be predictable, I've got a bunch of corporations in Las Vegas that I would love to introduce you to who understand that random processes can be very predictable. It's just how you think about predictability has to change. It's not that this item right here is going to take exactly 8.2 days, and this one's going to take 10.3 days, and this one's going to take 7.6 days. No, it's going to be more of a probabilistic statement that, hey, 85% of the items that flow through our process take 8 days or less. I have no idea if this particular one is going to take 1 day or 2 days or 3 days. I don't know. But I know it has an 85% chance of finishing in 8 days or less. Mm-hmm. Right? That's how we have to start thinking about predictability in terms of, in light of variation. So why does predictability matter? It matters because our customers care about it. They're the ones that are paying the bills. What's the very first question that your customers are going to ask you once you start to work on something for them? It's the very first question they're going to ask. When will it be done? It's the only thing they care about because they're trying to make decisions about how much more do I invest. They're trying to make decisions around risk. Do I keep going with this thing or do I pivot to something else, right? And a function of those decisions is how long it's going to take. And if we just kind of throw up our hands and say, I don't know, Agile says we don't have to be predictable, which, by the way, I would argue Agile doesn't say that. But if we throw up our hands and we say, Agile says we don't have to be predictable, not to put too fine a point on it, but that's when people start getting laid off. So,
yeah, very good point. One thing I would like to ask you about, maybe maybe the planning, the refinement, the prioritization is something that actually helps us in predicting when things will be done, and then we can tell them. So, maybe that's a good thing, actually. You're saying it's not.
Maybe. maybe planning does work. Mm-hmm. Like I said, remember, there's no complete yes and there's no complete wrong. I'm a betting person, and I know that I would bet coming out of any planning conversation, my perspective is always that I'm wrong. Right? I was never like that. I wasn't like this my whole life, right? For the first 10 or 15 years of my life, I kept thinking I was right, and I got sick of being wrong, and then it dawned on me, oh, I've got a much higher chance of being wrong than being right. And so I think that's really the perspective that we need to take. Coming out of planning, maybe we learned something, maybe. Maybe it helps us to understand, the work in the future, maybe. But I would argue uncertainty isn't driven out by planning conversation. Uncertainty is driven out by actually doing the work and putting it in the hands of the customer. So I think, again, this is just my thought, I think a much better strategy is, instead of focusing so much on that upfront planning, focus on, hey, how do we get this stuff through our process as quickly as possible and get it into the hands of our customers? Because that's when we really learn. That's when we really know if something has been good or not. So, should you stop all planning? If you got a couple beers in me, I would say yes. But if in the absence of alcohol, I would say if you want to do planning, make it as short as possible, because remember, chances are you're wrong. It's not that you're right. Chances are you're wrong. And if you are going to invest in process improvement, invest in getting that feedback loop as short as possible, because that's where the real learning happens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You've kind of answered the next question we have, and it's 10 people already voted for it out of everyone. So the question is actually, we started with planning, and now we were asking about continuous flow. So how can we ensure that the team actually delivers this continuous flow? Because, if you had a deadline, that a time box, we can say, you said this, you delivered that, it's a difference, so let's work on that and improve. You said this is noise, might be noise, right? Might
Yep.
be noise, might not be signal, right? So how do we deal with that? That continuous flow thing and helping teams be better.
Yep.
I would
So,
just say I would
yeah,
phrase it.
exactly. Great question. If we go back to that data set that I put up where the team had the upper limit was 65 days, and that was their process. The idea isn't that you expect every single item to take 65 days. That's not the idea. Because you saw, even in that process, there were a lot of items that were taking much less than 65 days. The idea is, if something takes longer than 65 days, there's a problem with our process. Now, if that system is stable, and I think we said pretty much that system was stable at 65 days, stable doesn't even necessarily mean useful, though. Right? The longer story that I actually get into this book, the longer story behind that team was they had, not only were they doing 2-week sprints, but they had set a goal for themselves that they would release once a month. Now, how do you think they were doing on their release once a month? Not so good either. From the customer's perspective, they were wildly unpredictable. But from a process perspective, they were extremely predictable. But now we got a problem. The customer is expecting a release every month. The process is saying we should expect, not that every item should, but we should expect items to take as long as 65 days. What do we do? Well, see, to me, that's where the real process improvement comes in, is we need to now figure out what do we need to do to align that voice of the customer once a month to the voice of the process up to 65 days. And that could mean changing our commitment to the customer. That could mean fundamentally changing how we work to try and improve the process, or it could mean both. But that's for me, that's the real conversation. So, yeah, getting back to the original question, items take kind of as long. That's not necessarily true, right? We want to make sure that we are delivering for our customers, because trust me, sooner or later, our customers are asking us when will it be done. Sooner or later, we have to deliver it. If we're not delivering, that's going to be a problem.
But you mentioned, that the voice of the customers is kind of arbitrary, right? So what do we do with that? Like, maybe it's arbitrary, maybe it's not, but it is the voice of the customer. What do we do? Like, when we have the voice of the process or voice of the customer, what do we do with that? Just disregard the one and, work with the other, or?
Right. Well, so yeah, when the voice of the customer is completely out of line with the voice of the process, and this is kind of where I was getting to before, the conversation that needs to happen is, which one of the things do we want to change, or do we want to change both? Because it's the customer who's probably going to be paying for that change. If we want to invest in process improvement, it's the customer who's going to pay for that. Deming talks about this a lot. It may not be economically feasible to change the process to get it to the customers, to get it to the customer specification. It's one thing that we need to investigate. It's one conversation that we need to have. But I'd want to understand the real business need behind why the customer is asking for what the customer is asking for, versus it's just some arbitrary guidance in a document somewhere. It could be, not to ramble on too much, it could be a regulatory requirement that we have to have this stuff done by this date or we're going to get a big fine. It could be a contractual obligation. It could be whatever. Okay, great. If that's our context, then we need to talk about, all right, how much are we willing to invest to adjust our process to get it to match what we're looking for?
Okay, thank you. So speaking in expectations versus reality and then investment to improve. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, the next question. I like this one. Do you think that Agile evolved to having cheap cash, allowing companies to experiment with low financial risk, and now the tide will turn and we'll do waterfall back again?
So cheap cash, is that?
Cheap cash, yeah.
100%. I know whoever said that, but I'd love to give you, I don't know if we're allowed to hug or kiss or whatever. But yeah, that is my fundamental theory, is when interest rates are at 0%, and which they have been for the past 10 years, and it's cheap money, it's essentially free money. Yeah, companies have been willing to spend on whatever. Sure, yeah, agile transformation, sure, digital transformation, sure, yeah, whatever, right? The money was free. It was essentially free. The CFOs weren't looking for a return on investment because it was free, right? It was free money. Now that there's a cost to that capital, now CFOs are demanding. They're saying, hey, this money's not free anymore. We actually have to see some results. And that's why I'm very, very sympathetic to people saying, you know what, I can't spend, you know, millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions on an agile transformation that's not really getting me anything. So yes, whoever said that, I completely, Agile, this quote unquote success of Agile was a product of cheap money, of free money, of essentially free money. You know, in the era of, you know, higher interest rates, you're already starting to see that pressure on the system. You're already starting to see that shift. So whoever asked that question, please come up to me afterward. I'd love to at least shake your hand, because that's, I think that's, is it? Yeah, I think that's exactly it.
Mm-hmm. Cool. But the question has a follow-up.
Now
the tide will turn and we'll go back to waterfall.
Oh,
better planning, better longer
projects. Yeah. Okay, right. So does that mean that we should go back to deterministic planning and waterfall and things like that? No, right? What it means is we need to take more of a risk management perspective, because we need to recognize, again, our process is variable. There's uncertainty inherent in our process. So we need to start looking at all of our planning and prioritization and what you know, all the stuff that we're not supposed to be doing. Look at it from a risk management perspective. You know, what are our chances of being right? By the way, the best book on this, if anybody hasn't read it, the best book on this is Annie Duke's Thinking in Bets. Annie Duke is a former poker player, and she talks about making decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So if you haven't read this book, absolutely read it, because every decision is a bet, and every bet has uncertainty, which means that we have to take a probabilistic kind of risk management approach to it. So deterministic, going back to waterfall and deterministic thinking is not the way, because we proved that didn't work. What we really need to do is take more of a, for lack of a better word, a more gambling perspective. Right? We are betting that this is the right thing to work on. We're betting that our business strategy is right. Okay, what's the cheapest way that we can verify that bet? Because notice, does anybody gamble? Because the best skill that a poker player, I dabble, the best skill that a poker player can develop is knowing when to get out of a pot. You notice poker players don't stay in all the way until the end and see every single pot. They don't do that. Once they realize, hey, this is not worth it for me to be in here, they get out. That's what we need to be. I think that's the approach that we need to be taking, rather than going back and, you know, doing like big upfront waterfall planning, deterministic thinking, and things like that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, we still have a lot of questions. 7 minutes. That's okay.
I need a couple minutes at the end to wrap up, so
that's okay. That's fine. Okay. So 5 minutes. I think 2 or 3 more questions. That one is interesting, because yeah, if we only bias towards noise versus signal, don't we lose our ambition in a way, right? So if we're listening to the voice of the process only, don't we lose our, okay, so it's like between this and that's kind of predictable. That's what we can deliver. Dear customer, get used to having 65-day deliveries.
Yep. Yeah. And this I think why the Wilt Chamberlain example is a great example. I think that the essence of professionalism, and I hope every single one of us in this room is professional, but I think that the essence of professional is showing up to work every day in the belief that you can get better. Mm-hmm. Not that you will, but that you can. Why did Wilt Chamberlain change from overhand to underhand? He knew he was going to get ridicule. He knew he was going to get made fun of. He knew he was, you know, why did he do that? Because he believed that he could get better. He had already won. Like I said, he'd already won MVP awards. He had already won, I don't know if he'd won a national championship at that point, but he'd already won all this stuff, but he still thought that he could get better. So I don't think we need a process or data or whatever to tell us, hey, you know, everything's fine. You know, just keep going on what you're going. You know, at some point you have to believe that you can get better. And you know, I think that's where the ambition comes from. That's where we can't just kind of sit on our laurels and say, oh, our data says we're fine, so let's not do anything.
Kind of following on from there, because if we say, you know, we have a stable system, now we say we have more ambition. If we have more ambition, we will be changing things. So we'll be actually destabilizing that system. So isn't that like, you know, something, you know, we want to stabilize it, but we destabilize it to make it different.
Yeah, and so that's where that's the trick is when you make that change. you don't necessarily respond to every new little data point that you come in. We don't know. We'll have to collect a certain amount of data to find out, to really verify, did that change succeed or not? Right? It's not like, oh, we made a change and look, our free throw percentage dropped by 2 percentage points. So we failed.
Yeah,
right? So let's just stop. Right? That's, if I didn't mean to imply that we're going in and we're changing every single day. That's like the Scrum team that goes in and changes what they're doing every 2 weeks. That's probably making things making things worse. But at some point we'll be able to have enough data that we'll be able to see whether we should keep going or not. By the way, I guess I didn't finish the Wilt Chamberlain story. Does anybody know? Did Wilt stick with the underhand shooting technique after the 62 season? I don't know if anybody knows this. He did not. Does anybody know why he did not?
He sprained his arm, maybe.
No. Just because he thought he looked stupid. He didn't look at the data. He didn't look at his. He's like, I look stupid, so I'm going to change. Now it turns out probably made the right decision, but for the wrong reason. So.
Okay. Yeah.
One more, and then.
Yes, one more, and then the wrap up. Okay, so this one is an interesting question about the how we measure things, but I'm missing the percent of the 2-point shoots. Maybe there are more important signals in a complex world. How should we check the connection between them? How many data points or data types or metrics should we use, right? So that's kind of you showed us like 2 ways of looking at things: the percent of free throws and the points scored, right?
Yeah.
Maybe there are different metrics in there.
Yeah. So absolutely. When we talk about flow, the place that I always recommend starting, like I said, it's a recommendation, but the place I always recommend starting and looking at is those 4 metrics of flow: cycle time, throughput, work in progress, and work item age. Those are because for me, those are the voice of your flow process. And we can look at those in. We could look at those in a process behavior chart, and we could understand, through that data, what our process is telling us. Will there be other metrics that you care about in your context? Almost certainly. For sure there will be. But those are kind of the 4 basic ones. I always think about, like, if you're a pilot, there's basic metrics you care about, like, altitude and airspeed and things like that. If you're a surgeon and performing surgery, you care about, like, blood pressure and oxygen levels in the blood and things like that. That's kind of the same thing. There's basic stuff in your flow process. Those are the 4 that I would start with. Above and beyond that, you'll just need to figure out in your context what's important to you. It would be impossible for me to say, in all contexts, this is what you should care about. But I think those 4 are a great start. If there's something wrong with those 4, then you've probably got problems you need to solve.
Thanks.
I just want to say a very quick thank you to the organizers of AgileByExample for the invitation to be here. Sorry I caused you a little bit of stress this morning. I did not mean to do that. Dan had a big lesson in variation this morning.
We just thought you were just in time.
And I was. So thank you so much for, I know what a big deal it is to put on a conference. To anybody who's never organized a conference before, trust me, it's a ton of work. So thank you so much for the organizers and the volunteers who make this happen. Thank you so much for the sponsors. Without sponsors, there is no conference. So I want to say anybody who has sponsored, thank you for that. But most importantly, thanks to all of you. I'm glad we get to do in-person conferences again after a couple of years. Grateful for your attention. Thanks for showing up, and looking forward to speaking to you all a little bit more. Have a great day. Have a great conference, everyone. Thank you.